Доброго ранку, український кризовий.
Good morning, esteemed colleagues. The Ukrainian Crisis Media Center is starting its day. The first press conference is on the monitoring mission on human rights situation in Ukraine. Our speaker is Fiona Fraser, the head of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine.
Ladies and gentlemen, good day to you all. I'm really delighted to be here with you, and I'm very happy to present a statement on our 13th report, the 13th Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights report on the human rights situation in Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission was deployed to Ukraine at the invitation of the government in March 2014. Its mandate is to monitor and report on the human rights situation in Ukraine, to assist and to advise the government in its compliance with international commitments and its accountability for human rights violation, and to support the promotion and protection of all human rights for all who live in Ukraine, in line with the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 68262. And as I said, today I'm going to present some of the findings of our 13th report that covers the period from the 16th of November 2015 to the 15th of February 2016. This report is based on the work of our team, which at its core has 27 human rights experts working across 6 offices, including in Donetsk, covering the territories controlled by the arms groups. We meet and interview victims of and witnesses to violations of international human rights law. We work across the contact line with all parties to the armed conflict. We focus on individuals, men, women, girls and boys, and the impact of the armed conflict as they continue to live in conflict-affected areas controlled by either armed groups or administered by the government, as well as looking at the human rights situation elsewhere in Ukraine, including in Crimea. In this report, one of our main aims is to give the voice to many of these people with whom we interview. The report covers the last 3 months and makes concrete recommendations to address the human rights violations that we have identified. The ceasefire in the east, agreed upon on the 1st of September and strengthened by the regime of complete silence introduced on the 23rd of December 2015, is at risk of unraveling. We must not allow this to happen. Since the beginning of the conflict, we have recorded 30,211 casualties in eastern Ukraine. Among these are civilians, members of the Ukrainian armed forces, and members of armed groups. This figure includes 9,167 people killed and 21,044 injured. We believe this to be a conservative estimate and that the real number of conflict-related casualties is considerably higher. Already, though, 30,000 Ukrainians, whether they are civilians, soldiers, or members of the armed groups, are casualties of this conflict, and it is already too many. The implementation of the Minsk agreements is the only way forward, the only viable strategy for achieving a peaceful solution in the East, and this is crucial for the protection of human rights in the conflict-affected area and elsewhere in Ukraine. We are, though, now observing the longest period of time since the beginning of the conflict when no large-scale indiscriminate shelling of populated areas has been taking place, and reports about individuals being killed from this shelling are in the singular. People, though, do, however, continue to die, increasingly from explosive remnants of war and improvised explosive devices. In this period, since the cut-off date of our report up until the 1st of March, we have recorded 61 casualties, 20 killed and 41 injured, with an overall figure over the reporting period of 381 casualties. In our report, we call for the urgent implementation of demining activities along major transport routes to checkpoints to remove explosive remnants of war and improvised explosive devices from roadsides. Clear and properly marked territories which have not been demined must be put in place, and we need to see the ceasing of the practice of planting booby traps. While this has been one of the quietest periods of the conflict, what we have seen in the last 3 months is of serious concern. Military objects continue to be embedded in residential areas on both sides of the contact line, endangering residents and disrupting their daily lives. People's homes continue to be damaged by artillery and shrapnel, damaging their roofs, making it too dangerous to stay or too difficult to return. The government has registered 1.6 million internally displaced persons who have fled their homes as a result of the conflict. IDPs, though, face discrimination in accessing basic services, and we are particularly concerned by recent reports that many IDPs may be denied social welfare benefits after being included on lists of the security services, often arbitrarily and without basis. We therefore recommend that the government of Ukraine develop a comprehensive and effective legal mechanism for civilians whose property has been damaged, looted or seized for military purposes in order for them to seek and receive restitution and compensation. Over the last 3 months, we have often been approached by people looking for relatives who are missing in the conflict zone. Throughout Ukraine, people struggle to understand why such little information is available on the fate of missing loved ones. Meanwhile, up to 1,000 bodies in government morgues remain unidentified. We urge the government and the proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and the self-proclaimed Lugansk People's Republic to exchange information and otherwise to cooperate in order to establish the whereabouts of people who've gone missing in the conflict zone, to provide unimpeded access of relatives to information on missing persons and related to their whereabouts and their condition. They must ensure that the bodies and remains of individuals killed in hostilities are treated with due respect and dignity, provide free and safe access to the areas where bodies and remains can be found, and to facilitate their identification. The victims and their families should always be at the center of any action. We are aware of a recent development that the Ministry of Justice is at the early stages of drafting a law on missing persons, which envisaged the creation of a National Information Bureau to centralize information on missing persons. This could be a very welcome and important development, and we look forward to engaging on this with the government. Failing to systematically address the issue of missing persons compromises reconciliation efforts. The clarification of the fate of missing persons should be at the center of any peace negotiations. In June and November of last year, 2015, Ukraine notified the UN Secretary-General of its intention to derogate from several provisions of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This is a foundational human rights treaty. By doing this, Ukraine is derogating from its obligations to guarantee the right to an effective remedy, the right to freedom from arbitrary arrest and detention and related procedural rights, the right to liberty of movement and freedom to choose one's residence, the non-derogable right to free trial, and the right to privacy. This will affect not only those who live in areas that the government does not effectively control, but also those who live in areas that it does partially and fully control. As a result, it may deprive nearly 6 million people of their rights in places beyond, on this side of the contact line, in government-controlled areas, in places such as Krasny Liman, Kramatorsk, and Mariupol. Even in areas that the government does not control, Ukraine still has human rights towards its citizens there, obligations towards its citizens there. Such a derogation cannot be indefinite. It must be periodically reviewed, ensuring that it is lifted or limited to a smaller geographic area as soon as it is no longer strictly required. Ensuring that Ukrainians living on the other side of the contact line can exercise their rights will alleviate their isolation, and it will also, we believe, remove a core driver of grievances against the government and counter the narrative of those who promote violence. Some 3 million people still live in conflict-affected areas. They are all Ukrainian citizens. Communities, though, have been divided, families separated. People living in those areas have repeatedly told me and our colleagues who work there that they just feel abandoned, that no one cares for them. This incremental feeling of isolation emboldens those who promote enmity and violence and undermines prospects for peace. Between 8,000 and 15,000 civilians cross the contact line on a daily basis. They have to pass through, at various crossings, up to 6 checkpoints, 3 operated by the government and 3 operated by the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, with a stretch of no man's land in between. When I went to Donetsk a few weeks ago, I observed, as many others do who travel that way, hundreds of cars, minivans and buses waiting in rows on either side of the road. Passengers spend the night in freezing temperatures and without access to water and sanitation. As a result of recent passport checks introduced by the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, freedom of movement has been further restricted, aggravating the isolation of those living in the conflict-affected areas. Policy decisions by the government of Ukraine have further reinforced, therefore, the existing contact line barrier. It is imperative, we believe, that those manning the checkpoints ensure safe and unhindered passage of civilians across the contact line, especially from areas of heightened hostilities, and that they refrain from imposing undue obstacles to free passage, such as additional checks and restrictions. If certain transport areas are closed for security reasons, all alternative options must be explored and new safe corridors established. We need to understand that people who live in the territories under the control of armed groups are particularly vulnerable to human rights abuses. We hear first-hand accounts of arbitrary detention, torture, and incommunicado detention by these members of armed groups. People have little means to seek redress and no meaningful voice. We are increasingly concerned about the lack of space for civil society actors to operate and for people to exercise their rights to freedom of expression, religion, peaceful assembly and association in territories controlled by the armed groups. In January 2016, we documented a wave of arbitrary arrests and detention of civil society actors in the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic. We strongly and firmly believe and recommend that all those unlawfully or arbitrarily detained must be released without delay and in conditions of safety. At the same time, in Kharkiv, Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia, we have also documented allegations of arbitrary and incommunicado detention, torture and enforced disappearances carried out by Ukrainian law enforcement officials. We are concerned that because of the introduction of a new State Bureau of Investigation, which is not yet operational, as of the 1st of March, the General Prosecution and Military Prosecution have lost their investigative functions. This creates an accountability gap. We therefore urge the Ukrainian authorities to ensure prompt and impartial investigation into each reported case of a human rights violation, as well as the prosecution of perpetrators. Accountability is critical to bring justice for victims, curtail impunity, and foster long-lasting peace. We have been granted access to official pre-trial detention facilities throughout areas under government control. And following some interventions, we have noted some improvements in conditions of detention and access to medical care for some detainees in pre-trial detention in Odessa, Kharkiv, Mariupol, Artemyevsk, and Zaporizhzhia. Furthermore, in some cases, our intervention also led to due attention being afforded to allegations of ill treatment and to law enforcement investigations into violations of other human rights in custody. These improvements confirm the importance for OHCHR to enjoy unfettered access to all places of detention, something I have said that we are able to do in government-controlled areas, but still yet have to be able to do in territories under the control of armed groups. Despite being denied access to the peninsula, Crimea, we have continued to follow closely the situation there in accordance with the UN General Assembly Resolution 68262. The imposition of the citizenship and the legislative framework of the Russian Federation, including penal laws and the resulting administration of justice, has affected human rights in Crimea, especially for ethnic Ukrainians, minority groups, and indigenous peoples such as Crimean Tatars. In a significant and worrying development, on the 15th of February, the prosecutor of Crimea filed a request with the Supreme Court of Crimea to recognize the Mejlis, the self-governing body of the Crimean Tatars, as an extremist organization and to ban its activities. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights seeks access to Crimea in order to ensure the effective fulfillment of its mandate. We also urge that the request to ban the Mejlis is lifted. Last week, as you all know, we marked the 2-year end to the Maidan violence and events that took place here in Kiev. These past 2 years have been extremely difficult for Ukraine. The socio-economic situation in the conflict areas and elsewhere in the country continue to further deteriorate as the situation remains volatile and often unpredictable. Commemorating the 2 years on from Maidan, we are particularly concerned about the lack of progress in the investigations and proceedings into the killings that happened there, as well as the killings on the 2nd of May 2014 in Odessa and the 9th of May 2014 violence that took place in Mariupol. The lack of progress in these cases undermines public confidence in the criminal justice system. It is essential that they be properly addressed with absolute impartiality, as their mishandling could jeopardize the peaceful resolution of disputes and fuel instability. Looking forward to the next 3 months, we are planning to support the implementation of the National Human Rights Action Plan, working hand in hand with the Council of Europe, the UN system in Ukraine, and other international partners, and of course the government, in order to conduct more technical assistance activities to build the capacities of national and local actors, including the Office of the Ombudsman, non-governmental organizations, in order to overall contribute to the strengthened human rights protection for all. I would like to say that we very much thank the government for extending the mandate of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine for a further 6 months until the 15th of September 2016. We stand ready to assist the government and all other partners working in Ukraine to fulfill obligations that the government has undertaken, to listen to victims and witnesses of human rights violations and abuses, and to give those who have been silenced, separated by an arbitrary line, or isolated a voice. All Ukrainians should listen and support the promotion and protection of human rights for all who live in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fiona. Now we'll be having a short Q&A session. Dear colleagues, are there any questions or clarifications? Зараз буде час на запитання. Колеги, якщо є питання, можете їх ставити як українською, так і англійською мовами.
Good afternoon, Victoria Ishchenko. Do you have information about the situation with the rights of children on occupied territories, including the rights of orphans?
Please switch on.
Since the start of hostilities, we've been working with other partners who work both in territories under the control of the armed groups and the government areas in trying to record and document the situation for children, and particularly for children in institutions of care. We followed a number of cases, And we work with, particularly with our other UN partners, obviously UNICEF and other international organizations on this matter. So it's an area that we're following. We don't have any particularly new development, besides the point to say that obviously children make up a large proportion of the population living in territories under the control of the armed groups. And one of the key things that we would be concerned about is that the question of documentation, civil registration documentation, and when babies are born, the need to ensure that they quickly have birth certificates recognized here by government-controlled areas, civil registration documentation that's issued in Donetsk or Lugansk, that it's easily and quickly recognized here by the government of Ukraine. There's been a welcome development. There's been a piece of legislation brought in that enables individuals who are coming from territories under the control groups with civil registration documentation to then go to a court and have this documentation recognized. What we're also urging that there is an immediate mechanism put in place so that all civil registration documentation that has been issued to people who live in either the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic or the self-proclaimed Lugansk People's Republic, that this civil registration documentation is automatically recognized here in Ukraine.
Thank you. Чи є ще питання, бо
Any other questions? Crimean News Agency, Irina Sulima, there is a danger now that Crimean Tatars could be eliminated on the occupied territory. They are stating that openly. And today there was an information that there are searches in the houses of Crimean Tatars. How could world community influence? How can they help save them as ethnic group? And how can you influence the decision of the government to pass a law that they are talking about, and how UN is able to get to the territory of Crimea and to control the situation, to monitor it?
please switch on the microphone.
As I mentioned, we are eagerly trying to access the peninsula, Crimea, because we do believe that it's very important to see at first hand what the human rights situation is for everybody who lives on the peninsula. So it's something that we're working with a lot of partners in the international forum on the whole question of how to ensure that there is access for monitors, independent monitoring bodies to go into Crimea. I think it's important that that's an issue that's discussed both obviously in Ukraine, but also at the higher level, at the more international level, be it at the different forums that exist. We, even though we're not present and have a monitoring team on the ground, we continue again with other partners to very much monitor and keep trying to raise the concerns, the harassment that we document of Crimean Tatars and the searches that go on and so forth. So I think it's just necessary for us as our overall community to keep closely following the situation, keep documenting the incidents, the violations that are reported to us, and keep trying to raise at all different forums and different levels the situation for Crimean Tatars, but also for the overall human rights situation in Crimea.
Radio Liberty, Tetiana Yakubovich. What are the conditions in which your experts work on the territory held by forces, if they allow you to work or maybe visit the places where people are present?
So, as I mentioned, we've had a presence in Donetsk since March 2014. We have a team there that is able to cover the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic as well as the self-proclaimed Lugansk People's Republic. Also, as I said, one of the main our main way of working is the interviewing of victims and witnesses of violations of international human rights law. And we do have access to individuals to interview and document and record, therefore, their allegations, their reports of human rights violations. So we are able to work both in Donetsk and Lugansk. The key concern that we have is that we would like to have access to places of detention, because we do feel that the situation and the conditions in places of detention is underreported. So that's something we are still striving for.
Колеги, є час на останнє запитання.
Have time for one more question.
Ms. Fiona, are there any improvements in this your report comparing to the previous one? And if yes, then please specify which.
Well, first of all, I think as I laid out at the beginning, I mean, it's clearly a marked improvement, the fact that we've seen the quietest period, so to speak, in the conflict in the last three months. And the result of that is we've seen far less casualties and far less civilian casualties, as well as far less shelling into residential areas, which therefore, so less people being killed from shelling. The problem is, of course, that we continue to see people being killed or injured from landmines or unexploded ordnance. So there's still a lot of work to do on that front. Also, I think that we, as I also mentioned, it's very important to emphasize that we have, following interventions that we've undertaken, seen a response from the government ministries or government agencies on issues that we've raised about concerns in places of detention. This is a very welcome development, and we would encourage that, further recommendations or interventions we undertake, both with the government of Ukraine, and I would say with the authorities in the self-proclaimed republics, that they take them on board and then bring about some positive action, because that's what really makes a difference on the ground. We've also, you'll be aware of all the, we call them simultaneous releases going on, exchanges, as is well known. I mean, what's also been a change is that now people are actually being part of this process, and they have their identity documents. Obviously, that's very important to have your identity document, because if you don't, then you're very open to exploitation. And this brings me to the point that I also raised with the question of the children, is that it's extremely important to resolve the issue of civil registration documentation to really ease the daily lives of those who continue to reside in territories under the control of the armed groups. And also we did see amendments to the law on IDPs, which now has sort of eased the way for registration and for many, and has also enabled stateless persons to be considered IDPs. I just want to say a few things that we really need to see improvements on. We need to see more improvement on accountability, investigations of human rights violations. We're concerned about this whole issue with regard to the question of social pensions and whether people will be able to have their payments and so forth. And we also really want to urge the government to address the question of the derogation, to ensure that there are no limitations being placed on its guarantees for human rights protection in areas that it does control. So to set up a mechanism whereby it reviews to make sure that it is really needed and it is proportional.
Thank you a lot for coming. We're going to finish the press conference at this point, and looking forward to seeing you here at Ukraine Crisis Media Center in the nearest future. Thank you a lot. Колеги, ми на цьому закінчуємо прес-конференцію. Наступна прес-конференція.
Our next press conference, Colonel Matuzyannik